Thank you, sir. Will you please tell us your name and responsibility with regard to the MDG in Africa?
My name is Charles Abugri, and I am the Regional Director of the UN Millennium Campaign, which has responsibility for mobilizing attention and actions for progress to achieve the MDGs in Africa. And the regional office is based in Melaku.
3 years to end the development program.
Okay. I think every African country has made tremendous progress towards achieving one or more of the MDGs. I think as many as 50% of the countries will achieve between 1 and 3 of the MDGs. Many other countries will be just about around the MDG targets. Even the countries that do not achieve the MDGs, what is really important is not so much the target, but the progress that they are making in their countries relative to the situation that they began with in the year 2000. In fact, if you look at the rate of progress of Africa in the MDG areas compared to the rate of progress in, say, South Asia or the Pacific or the Caribbean, Africa has made much faster rate progress in many of the areas compared to even some of the countries that are faster growing like India. The reason, so this rate of progress which that they have made, as I said, is significant because many of them started from an extremely low base under extremely harsh conditions. We have to remember that virtually every African country was faced with nearly 20 years of structural adjustment programs that cut down government's ability to spend on healthcare, education, generate jobs. So at the beginning of 2000, many of them are facing severe problems with their education systems, their healthcare systems. Agriculture had all but collapsed through the liberalization of agriculture, the opening up of markets, and the withdrawal of government from supporting small farmers. So agriculture was in a really bad state by the year 2000. So that is why the progress since 2000, after the MDGs, many of these countries actually corrected their policies using the poverty reduction strategies programs and have made tremendous progress. But there are some areas where progress we need to pay a lot of attention to. There is progress in enrollment of education, but it's a question of quality. There is progress in narrowing the gap between girls and boys in virtually every country, but that's only in relation to primary school education. The higher you go up the ladder in secondary school and tertiary school, the wider the gap between boys and girls. So in education, we have the crucial issue of narrowing the gap beyond primary school education and ensuring that the quality of education improves for all. In relation to HIV/AIDS, I remember that in the run-up to 2000, the rate of infections, of new infection in HIV in many parts of Africa was so dramatic that some of the projections were that by the year 2015-2020, Africa would have lost more than between half to 2/3 of its human resources from AIDS. But at that time, there were so few people who had access to retroviral drugs that HIV/AIDS contracting HIV was basically associated with imminent death. I think since 2000 and to the moment, millions of Africans have access to HIV and retroviral drugs. The rate of infections have slowed dramatically, and the knowledge in terms of prevention of infections has also increased quite dramatically, and the use of preventative things, material such as condoms, has also increased dramatically in many countries. But this progress is slowed in the past 3, 4, 5 years. We seem to be taking our eyes off the ball. We seem to, in some countries, the education for the use of condoms has basically been slowed down, sometimes through religious and other reasons, which is encouraging only abstention and not the use of condoms as an additional measure, and so on. We need to return to a strong focus on preventative measures. And there is also a serious danger that resources for treatment has declined. In recent times, the Global Fund is having great difficulty replenishing their fund. We have made progress also significantly in reducing malaria-related deaths of children, both through the distribution and increased use of mosquito-treated nets and campaigns, sanitation campaigns, especially in the urban areas. That said, mosquito-treated nets have been shown to be not totally foolproof. Sanitation campaigns and public health, investments have declined in many of our countries, and as non-communicable diseases, the agenda of non-communicable diseases are growing, especially within the middle classes, and attracting resources away from continuing to address communicable diseases. I think there are three areas in which our progress has been pretty poor across the board. One is maternal mortality. Maternal mortality in many countries have increased rather than decreased. And the rate of progress in countries where maternal mortality has decreased is slow. This is partly as a result of a reflection of serious and equal gender relations and the continued dire poverty situation and lack of freedom for women. The maternal mortality is the one indicator, which is a very composite indicator, probably one of the most potent indicators of empowerment of women. Everything comes down to it. Reduced malnutrition or poor malnutrition, stress, exposure to diseases, exposure to violence at the household level, lack of access to reproductive health services as a result of very low reproductive health rights and the promotion of reproductive health. So maternal mortality, which in fact is the most potent reflection of the situation of gender inequality, is an issue that cuts across virtually every African country and needs to be addressed with urgency. It's an issue of power and power relations, not simply an issue of access. The other area which needs to be addressed urgently is the situation of employment and underemployment. This employment issue had been so underemphasized in the last 12 years or so of the MDGs that the recent Arab Spring brings starkly in our minds that it is hardly possible to sustain peace and to measure economic progress when the young people have no access to jobs, and the population generally access to jobs and jobs that earn incomes that can sustain families. That those opportunities have declined and are declining. Unemployment and underemployment is pervasive across the whole continent. Hardly any country can boast of having made significant progress in supply and employment. Whether that the countries have rapid growing economies such as Ethiopia and Ghana, or slow-growing economies elsewhere, such as Kenya, or moderately growing economies such as South Africa. Whether those economies are dominated by natural resources, such as Nigeria, or they are relatively diverse economies, such as South Africa. Whether they are small economies, or they are large economies. Very few exceptions, such as Seychelles and Mauritius. So, in a sense, employment, and unemployment, and underemployment should be one of the biggest agendas and programs going forward into the next 3 years. And the final area, which affects incomes, employment, and other MDGs indicators, is growing inequality. Inequality is not an express indicator we have been monitoring, but the last MDG summit in 2010 the outcome of that summit said very clearly that inequality is a reason why economic growth and the impact of economic growth on poverty reduction is so slow. We have to address inequality. Inequality is also the reason why it is difficult to address gender differences. And inequality can be a major source of tension in our societies. And that, in fact, even in countries where the overall progress in MDG seems to be good, if you go down at a regional or state, or you divide them by geographic spaces, there is wide disparities where some parts seem to be making progress, and many regions and sections, in some cases, are actually going backwards. So you can have overall achievement of the MDGs, whilst the poorest regions and the poorest people's conditions would have deteriorated. So going forward, we have to address the issue of the equitable impact of development. Now, is 3 years too short? No, 3 years is not too short. The reason is that we haven't started, at a very, very difficult time. Many of our economies are making progress. They are no more declining. They are all growing at one pace or the other, but they are not stagnating. So there is potential to mobilize more domestic resources and put into MDGs achievement. We've had a lot more human resources developed since the last 10 years than we have ever had. More teachers, more nurses. We have learned our lessons about neglecting our farmers, agriculture, and rural development. We have learned our lessons about opening economies too wide without sufficient regulation. We are learning our lessons about the dangers of growing inequality.